It was just destruction that didn't need to take place. The violence in the murder, it wasn't just a single shot. Linda was shot in the head and stabbed. David Lacey was shot several times. Same thing with Harold Drury. We had a serial killer at that point.
They say that your life flashes before your eyes, before you're killed. I don't know how much time my dad had to think, but if there's any wish that I have, it's that he knew that I loved him.
Not only did they kill her, but the torture they put her through before. I mean, that's an animal. But he was a good person until this point in his life. It's hard to even think that he's in prison and he's never coming home. He looks so young. And he just kind of looks hollow. It's a shame that the people that he hurt will never know that at one time Chad wasn't like that. I miss the old Chad. The Chad before he started getting in trouble and doing horrific, horrible, mean things. That just tears you up to think somebody you love so much could really be that person inside. Chad was a neighbor that lived on the same street that we did. He was next to the youngest of 5 kids. He was delightful. I was probably 16, and Chad was just a few months old when I started babysitting. The first time they asked me to babysit, I went down to their house, and I couldn't believe what I saw when I walked in. It was filthy dirty. The kids were filthy dirty. Laundry everywhere. A couch that had just been urinated on over and over. His mom had a temper. Not that she ever, I don't think, got physical with the kids, but she was a screamer. And she seemed like she was in over her head. And the dad just wasn't, he worked, that's what he did. Within seconds, I knew I wasn't staying there to babysit. That if she wanted me to babysit, they were coming to my house. They never wanted to go home. They always wanted to stay. As they got older, it was just Chad mostly spending the night. And I mean, he would stay the night for days at a time. He just seemed like he was so happy when he was with us, and then he would start crying when we had to take him back home. It was really sad. My parents were crazy about Chad. He called them mom and dad. I believe my parents talked to Chad's mother about adopting. I think she would have done it. Chad's father was not on board with the adoption plan. It makes me sad that we didn't get him, because his life would have been different, I'm sure.
was about 7:45 in the morning, and my sergeant called me and said that there was a body of a black male that was found in the desert off the side of the road. I was going to be the case agent. So when I arrived on scene, it was a 2-lane highway, desert on both sides of the property. What I first observed is his shirt was pulled up, belly was kind of exposed, his pant pockets were pulled out as if someone went through them. You could obviously see dry blood on the side of his head. I could tell that he was shot several times. David was a loner. He lived a quiet man's lifestyle, and he worked almost every day in that cab company. As I was responding to the scene, I learned that a taxi cab had been found several miles away, and it was completely ransacked. The vehicle was shot up. The tires were shot, the hood was shot, the windows were smashed. It was just totally destroyed. Whoever shot and killed David Lacy and left his body at the first scene, then transported the taxi cab to the second scene. That's when the vehicle was ransacked. It was just destruction that didn't need to take place. I thought it was an attempted robbery that turned into a murder. But why wouldn't they just dump it and leave and get the heck out of there? We had the physical tire evidence. We had the physical footprint evidence. We took every print that we could get out of the cab, and a bloody fingerprint was found in the back seat of the car. But we tried to identify someone that had left that latent print, and we didn't find anyone at that point. In this particular case, the number one thing was trying to identify who committed this crime. But how are we going to do that with the limited information that we had?
This is a picture of me and my dad. And I was a daddy's girl growing up. I was a mommy's girl too. But I had that special thing with my dad. So we had that bond. I haven't seen this picture in a long time. Thinking of him brings up some bad stuff. The later years were, not good memories, but he's my dad. And I don't want to forget him just because of some bad stuff that happened. I was in basic training 12 days when I got the call. We were in the barracks, and the drill sergeant said that I had to go with him to see the chaplain. I immediately thought something was wrong. So I go into the chaplain's office, and my drill sergeant asked me to sit down. And he says to me that Dad was working at a convenience store and was shot to death in Phoenix in a robbery. And I said, "No, sir, you got the wrong, it's not my dad. You got the wrong guy. There's no way he worked at a convenience store. Not my dad. He owns his own company." So he said, "No, I'm sorry." And of course, my first thought is the group had something to do with it. I think my dad got manipulated by these people. What they said went. And if you did something wrong, they would decide what would happen. And it was alluded to that if you left, something bad would happen. The fear of leaving was that no matter how scared you were, you didn't want to leave. There was a fear there. That's one reason I joined the military. I had to get away. I was scared. That was my first thought. Maybe he was trying to leave. Maybe he did something wrong. I initially was very convinced they had to have something to do with it. And then terror set in all over again. I think it took quite a few days or a couple days for the murder to sink in. I think there was so much going on with his death. So many what ifs, the questions surrounding those people. What happened? What did you do to get in trouble? I hadn't spoke to him in 2 years. There was a lot of guilt with that, but yet it was self-preservation. I had to cut ties. He made his choice. I had to make mine. I started hearing my dad talk more about this business partner almost on a daily basis. I was overhearing that they wanted to start some sort of electronics business, that my dad would be doing the finance part of it. I don't remember hearing specifically what his partner would be doing, but my dad would be gone from the home at weird hours. Some days it would be normal, but other days he would not be home for dinner. I started noticing a change when my stepmom started to accompany my dad to go wherever they were going.
The word of the Lord came unto me, saying,
The Bible study was at the man's home, who my dad worked with.
Thus saith the Lord God,
It was just scripture reading, and people would take turns reading.
the end is come upon the four corners of the land.
There were a couple other kids there.
The end come upon thee.
Initially, I started going to these meetings once a week. And then eventually it got to 2 times a week.
Will judge thee according to thy
And then it started being a little bit more. We would go, or we would stay longer than we did last time.
I shall not spare thee.
Some nights we would be kept out into the wee hours of the morning. That became a norm. Something was out of sorts because it was a very scheduled home. You had a bedtime, even in high school. It wasn't like my dad to break the rules. The life before the group and during the group was very gradual. I didn't see a massive overnight change. It was just a gradual progression. And it was a grooming process.
The cab company didn't really get any information of the party, of what they wanted or where they're going to go. We talked to the Circle K clerk that was there that evening. In those days, they didn't have really good video surveillance like they do now. So we're developing ways to try and figure out who made that phone call. The phone call came in from a pay phone. There was a pay phone that was right outside the Circle K. We went as far as printing that entire pay phone. But fingerprints, when you obtain them, there's not just a computer that you just shove them in and they're gonna point out and tell you who they are. I was quickly running out of leads. We didn't have a name of a party being picked up. We didn't have a location of where he was going to be dropped off at that we could follow up on. So we had nowhere to go. Her name was Linda Reynolds. She was 32 years old. She was married, had children, and working as a pizza delivery driver. As I understand, she had an order that she had to deliver to a house that was on the west side. They found her vehicle the next morning, and it was completely ransacked and left in a desert area. The hood was up, all the wires in the engine were cut, the windows were smashed. It was just destroyed. Within 100 yards of the vehicle, they found the body of Linda Reynolds. David Lacey's body was found in the same area, within miles. They saw two different sets of footprints, and another vehicle, tire prints were found in the desert along with Linda's vehicle. The destructiveness of both the vehicles, the violence in the murder, wasn't just a single shot. Linda was shot in the head and stabbed. There was a lot of similarities between the two, and I thought to myself, we had a serial killer at that point. And I was worried that it could happen again soon.
It's just sad. It really is. You know, even at this age, he could have come to any of us and said, I need help. Chad was always very quick-witted. He was a happy person. He would make anybody laugh. He didn't like anybody to be upset. And I think he had some learning disabilities. He struggled, but no. It's hard to even think he's never coming home. Ugh. As he got a little older, I think he probably rebelled more. He got a little cockier. I think he had quit school completely. His friends were questionable. They just seemed shady. Not the kind of friends you want your kids to have. But David, Chad's friend, was actually a nice kid to be around. In 1992, Chad and David came to the house just to visit. Hadn't seen him in a while. And after a little bit, Chad asked my son, Travis, to go outside to see the Jeep that he and my husband were building. So they went out to the garage. And while they were out there, evidently Chad asked Travis if he could leave a gun there for a couple of weeks. I found out later, my son said no, and they left. And that's when I knew something had to be going on that wasn't good, but I didn't know what. I figured maybe they held somebody up. Never would I have thought he could hurt someone. Never.
There was a point where I started realizing something had changed. The biggest thing was the diet. Couldn't eat certain things. Noticing the fridge was a little scarce. I remember ketchup. Could no longer eat ketchup because it was the devil. Noticed our cereal started missing. Noticed that the portions were smaller. Keeping people tired from the long Bible studies to the wee hours, saying what we could and couldn't eat, or when we could or couldn't eat. That is a total form of control. At one point, I was told, you're not playing sports anymore. It was because his business partner didn't want me wasting my time doing that I needed to focus more on what was going on in the group. I was extremely sad. I was extremely angry. I was devastated, yet not being allowed to be mad. I don't think my dad questioned those rules because at this point, had quit his other job. He was all in. The business was like an electronics business. Repair of VCRs and stereos, even building circuit boards. Everybody in the group worked at this business. I even worked there making circuit boards. So after school, I would go into the office, and that's what I would do. Sometimes they would stop the work and do a Bible study. Things started changing in the Bible studies when the leader claimed that he was the brother of Jesus. People would wash this man's feet, and you followed what he said. If you were incorrect, you got called out in front of the entire group. If you did something wrong, there was always a repercussion. My eyes right here. At one point, my dad was being berated and not react and just take it. That was not the man that I knew as my dad. And I wanted to cry and ask him, why did you let them do that to you? I wanted to yell out in the middle of it. I didn't dare do it. It still resonates, anger. It really makes me angry when I think about it. And it makes me more angry that I didn't say anything. But you did not dare question why. Even if you wanted to, you didn't. You went along with it. You just became numb. When you're mentally tired and exhausted and run down and malnourished, it messes with somebody's mind. I was like, oh man, I'm in this. The stuff's getting serious, but there was no out.
They had discovered a ATM photo of Linda and an unknown suspect. Sometime during the evening that she was captured, they took her to the ATM to try and extract some money. It was late at night, and the suspect was not in full view of the camera, so it was only a partial view of half of his face. Linda didn't make a lot of money or have a lot of money, and I think she was only able to get $20 out of the ATM. We didn't have any particular person in mind at that time, but we knew that they were a white male and from an age range of in the 20s to 30s. What I learned is that that West Side location that she delivered it to was an abandoned house. I felt someone needed to be familiar with the area, number one, to know that that was there. I was able to get some information about the original call, that they ordered a Hawaiian pizza. Instead of having ham on it like it normally does, they had pepperoni on it. I asked, can I get information of how many people in this area ever ordered that exact same order of pizza? And they said, sure, they could do it. The next day, the Phoenix detective did what's called a knock and talk. He went up to the house, knocked on the door. The owner confirmed that her stepson sometimes ordered Hawaiian pizzas, and her stepson was named David Hunt.
This is a picture of me and my dad before the group. Those are good times. Those are good times. I'm not sure what my dad's vulnerability was. Somehow that man found one spot in my dad's head that wasn't the dad that I knew. And he found it and he took advantage of it. When I graduated from high school, the group opened an office in Nevada, and I was moved up to Nevada into an apartment to take care of the business. I still had to read my Bible. I still couldn't eat ketchup, even though I was alone. But I didn't dare put ketchup on anything. Even though they weren't there, they were there. But I was still in that terror stage, the fear stage, where I did not dare leave. I wanted to so bad, but I didn't dare do it. I was scared. I had been removed from them just long enough that I didn't want to go back. At that point, that is when I spoke to my father on the phone. And I remember him saying, you have to come home. And I said, Dad, I'm not coming back. And he cried and he begged. And I kept saying no. That was the hardest thing in my life up to that point that I had to do. Because I knew I was losing my dad. I knew I was literally walking away from my father that I was never going to see again, and my stepmother. Never going to see him again. That was hard, but I needed to get away. I needed to get out. That was the last time I spoke to my father before he passed. That was the last conversation I had with him, but I didn't go back.
ATM photos were not in color at that time. They were very grainy. It was late at night. It was only a partial view of his face, but I thought it was a picture of Chad Lee. And so Chad and David went down to the Phoenix police, and they even offered up voluntarily giving their finger and palm prints. They denied any involvement in the Linda Reynolds murder. You know, they were cool and calm. I was really surprised the way they acted. I wondered if we had the right guys. But later on, I got a phone call from my sergeant saying that they had positively identified prints of Chad Lee on a bloody thumbprint that they found in the taxicab of David Lacey. David Hunt at the time was 14 years old. And we contacted his father, and his father gave us permission to talk to him. David Hunt started telling us about the taxi cab driver. And what he told us was basically on that night, they were both wanting money, and Chad was going to call for a cab, and when the cab arrived, he was going to get in the cab, and David Hunt was going to follow in another car. And as David pulled up, he saw Chad covered in blood. And Chad told him what he had done, that when he pulled up the gun and demanded money, David Lacey came over the back seat in an attempt to grab the gun, and then Chad started firing. And he said he shot 9 times. And he told us that, yes, he was involved with the Pizza Hut delivery driver, Linda Reynolds. But he put most of the blame on Chad Lee, that Chad had raped her, and said that Chad had been the one to kill her ultimately. He, again, was minimizing his responsibility in the whole thing. But Chad was a whole different story. He felt like he was a star and was really talkative. Chad admitted responsibility that he was involved in the murder, but not the sexual assault. As he told it, Linda pulled away from him to get away, and he shot her in the back of the head. As she laid on the ground, he said she was moaning and groaning, and he picked up a knife. And he brought this knife back and plunged it twice into her chest, killing her. At the end of my interview, he kind of bent over, almost in the fetal position, and was holding his sides. And then he started to say that he murdered Harold Drury, the convenience store worker. I was shocked. And what he told me was, as he entered, he walked up to the counter and he brought up the .22 revolver and asked for the money. He said that Harold Drury fought back. At that point, he said he shot him several times. He grabbed the cash register drawer and ran out of the place. I think he was excited after he murdered each one of them. I really think he was playing the part of the bad gangster. They've been on a crime spree for a while, and they thought they were invincible. No doubt in my mind, if we wouldn't have stopped them, they would have done more. They'd have just kept going.
The day I found out that they had caught the man who had confessed to killing my father, I was just rageful. There were days before I found out about Chad being caught and confessing where I was positive it was the people from the group. But the fact that he confessed to that, it helped me let go of it was the group that set him up, that did it, because he had murdered other people. Maybe if he only murdered my dad and that was it, I still would have held on to it could have been someone from the group. I was happy that they caught him, but my overall emotion was rage. My biggest thing is for guilt. If I never left, he wouldn't have needed that job. So I sit with that guilt be it right or wrong, you know, if I would have stayed, if I would have come home, I would have had a job and he wouldn't have needed to be working overnight at a convenience store. They say that your life flashes before your eyes, before you're killed. I don't know how much time he had to think, but if there's any wish that I have, it's that he knew that I loved him. I still loved him, I still cared about him. I don't want him dying thinking that I didn't.
We had confessions of detailed information about what took place. I think they got less than $300 from all of the murders. You know, it's a shame that these people had to die for just such a little thing or die at all. The personality that Chad displayed doing these things during the act, he was mad, he was angry, he was violent, very violent. But then talking to him in the interview room, he was kind of like trying to be my friend and was joking around with me. I think he thought he was the superstar at the time, that, you know, it was a big deal. We don't often have multiple homicides done by the same person, and I think he was just riding that wave.
It seemed fake, like we were in a movie or something when I was hearing the stuff they did. And that wasn't the Chad I knew. I don't know what happened or when it happened. But he was a good person until this point in his life. How could he have changed overnight like that? Well, it just takes the air out of you, because you know then that there isn't a chance. He's not going to come home. I can't imagine what Chad feels when he thinks about it. You know, and if it wasn't him, I'd probably say they deserved it. I know that maybe he deserves it, but I just, it still hurts. You still love him. You still think of them as the person you knew before. And it's hard to just turn that off and look at him as a bad person now. So I can't completely give up on him. I still pray for him. I still wish it wouldn't have happened.
I don't know what's become of the group to this day. I personally have not sought them out. I was told that the business partner got in a very bad car accident and died. I'm gonna look like a really bad person saying this, but dying in your sleep would have been too easy. You know, I don't wish ill on anyone, except for two people in this world, and one of them's gone, and the other one isn't yet.
Who ripped your dad away from you, the group or Chad Lee?
Wow, that's a good question. I would say Chad. Because there's a part of me that wants to believe that at some point my dad would have left. But the way I look at it is Chad stripped my dad from me because he didn't have a chance to get out of there. I think my dad was just as much a victim as I was. He was an adult, should have known better. I don't know what was told to my dad to coax him into this situation. I don't know what made him turn to go down that road and then eventually bring us with him. He got conned the same way I got conned. Yes, I was a kid, but people in that group, they were taught how to react, when to react, and when not to react. That's what you were taught. It was all control. It was all conning. There's a small little piece in my brain, I think, that'll always be there and always make me look over my shoulder. That situation is more traumatic than even my dad's murder because it encompassed my life for years. It happened, I lived it. There's no denying that it happened. It's just part of who I am, it made me who I am today.
The call came just after sunrise. Not a scream, not a gunshot, not the kind of emergency dispatchers remember for years. Just silence. A long-distance line opened from a payphone near the edge of a quiet California town. The operator answered. No words came back. Only breathing. Slow, uneven, then a click. The call lasted 14 seconds. At the time, nobody cared. 39 years later, investigators would dig that recording out of an evidence archive and listen to it again and again, wondering if they were hearing the final moments of a terrified witness, or the calm satisfaction of a killer who believed he had gotten away with murder. Because that same morning, the town woke up to a mystery that would haunt it for decades. A mystery that still refuses to die. California, autumn, 1985. The town was the kind of place where people forgot to lock their doors. Tree-lined streets, fresh-cut lawns, pickup trucks parked outside diners before sunrise. A place where everybody recognized everybody. Children rode bicycles after dark. Parents didn't worry. Nothing ever happened here. Until something did. 23-year-old Melissa Hart was known across town. The renewed investigation moved with a speed nobody in town had seen in years. For decades, the case had existed in a strange limbo. Not closed, not active, suspended somewhere between memory and myth. Detectives occasionally reviewed the file. Reporters occasionally revisited the story. Every anniversary generated a few headlines. Then silence returned. Now the silence was gone. People who had not spoken about Melissa Hart in 20 years suddenly found microphones pointed at their faces. Neighbors who once exchanged casual greetings began studying one another with suspicion. Old rumors crawled back into daylight. And at the center of it all stood a question that had never been answered. What happened between 9:30 p.m. and the discovery of the abandoned car? Investigators reconstructed the timeline again. Every minute, every movement, every known detail. Melissa left work. She entered her blue sedan. She drove away. Then the trail vanished. No confirmed sightings after that point. No verified phone calls. No credit card activity. Nothing. The darkness swallowed her whole. But modern investigators had something detectives in 1985 never possessed. Digital reconstruction. Satellite mapping. Advanced forensic modeling. Artificial intelligence capable of analyzing old witness statements for hidden patterns. Thousands of pages were scanned into databases. Every interview, every tip, every note scribbled into margins decades earlier. Patterns began to emerge. Not answers. Patterns. One analyst noticed something peculiar. The mysterious service road where Melissa's vehicle had been found was mentioned repeatedly in unrelated police reports from the mid-1980s. Trespassing complaints, illegal dumping, late-night vehicle sightings, suspicious activity. Individually, none of the reports appeared significant. Together, they suggested something unexpected. The road may not have been as isolated as investigators originally believed. Someone used that area. Frequently. The question was who? And why? As researchers dug deeper, another forgotten detail resurfaced. 3 weeks before Melissa vanished, a local rancher reported seeing a vehicle parked near the same stretch of road. He described it as a dark pickup truck. The report generated little attention at the time. No crime had occurred. No suspect had been identified. The observation simply disappeared into paperwork. Now it looked different. Now it mattered. Because a dark pickup truck sounded familiar. Very familiar. Years earlier, one witness claimed a dark truck had followed Melissa's sedan. At the time, the account seemed unreliable, one among hundreds of conflicting statements. But viewed through the lens of new evidence, the coincidence became difficult to ignore. Investigators began searching registration records from 1985. The process proved exhausting. Thousands of vehicles, thousands of names, many records incomplete, others destroyed, some owners deceased. Still, detectives persisted. Then another bombshell arrived. A forensic genealogist working the DNA evidence identified a broader family network connected to the unknown male profile recovered from Melissa's vehicle. The DNA itself remained insufficient for a direct identification, but the family tree pointed towards several individuals with historical ties to the region. People who lived nearby during the mid-1980s. People who had never appeared prominently in the original investigation. The discovery sent shockwaves through the task force. For nearly 40 years, detectives had focused on one pool of suspects. Now a completely different pool emerged. Fresh names, fresh possibilities, fresh danger. Because every cold case investigator knows the same uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the original investigation looks in the wrong direction. Not because detectives are careless, because they are human. They work with incomplete information. And once a theory takes hold, it can cast a very long shadow. As genealogical analysis continued, investigators quietly conducted surveillance on several individuals linked to the family tree. Nothing dramatic, nothing public. Background checks, property reviews, interviews. The goal was simple: find anything, any connection, any overlooked thread. Meanwhile, journalists descended on the town. National news outlets sensed a major breakthrough. The phrase "California 1985 cold case reopened" appeared everywhere. Online forums exploded. Podcasts devoted entire episodes to speculation. Amateur investigators began publishing theories daily. Some theories sounded plausible. Others bordered on fantasy. The noise became overwhelming. And hidden within that noise was something dangerous. False memories. Witnesses began calling police claiming they suddenly remembered details from 1985. Hundreds of calls arrived. Most proved useless. Human memory is fragile. After decades, stories become tangled with headlines, conversations, documentaries, and imagination. Investigators had to separate fact from contamination. Then came a witness nobody expected. A retired truck mechanic named Raymond Cole. In 1985, he had lived less than 2 miles from the service road. Detectives interviewed him during the original investigation. Back then he offered nothing of value. Now, nearly 40 years later, he requested another meeting. He appeared nervous, uneasy, almost frightened. The interview lasted 6 hours. According to investigators, Raymond described something he had never previously disclosed. On the night Melissa disappeared, he claimed he heard 2 vehicles speeding down the road shortly before midnight. One sounded like a passenger car. The other sounded larger, possibly a pickup truck. Minutes later, he heard shouting. Not words, just shouting. Then silence. When detectives asked why he never reported it, Raymond gave an answer that sent chills through the room. He said he believed somebody already knew. The statement made little sense. Investigators pressed him. Who knew? What did he mean? Raymond struggled to explain. He described seeing law enforcement vehicles in the area the following morning and assumed whatever happened had already been discovered. Whether his account was accurate remained uncertain, but the timing aligned disturbingly well with other evidence. Again, a pickup truck surfaced. Again, the service road appeared central. Again, the mystery deepened. As investigators expanded their review, another file emerged from storage. A burglary report, dated 11 days before Melissa vanished. At first glance, it seemed unrelated. The victim reported seeing a suspicious man near his property shortly before the break-in. Attached to the report was an artist's sketch. Detectives stared at it in disbelief. The drawing looked remarkably similar to the unidentified stranger repeatedly mentioned by witnesses before Melissa's disappearance. The resemblance wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Enough to reopen questions nobody had asked in decades. Who was the stranger? Why was he repeatedly observed around town? Why did he vanish after Melissa disappeared? And why had investigators never identified him? The sketch circulated internally. Retired detectives reviewed it. Former residents examined copies. No definitive answer emerged. Yet the stranger's presence began feeling less like coincidence and more like a missing piece. Somewhere, somehow, he fit into the story. The challenge was proving it. The months that followed produced another disturbing revelation. Evidence technicians re-examining archived photographs noticed something nearly invisible in the original crime scene images. A reflection, tiny, blurred, captured in the rear window of Melissa's abandoned sedan. Modern enhancement techniques sharpened the image. Not enough for identification, but enough to reveal a shape. A vehicle, parked behind Melissa's car. A second vehicle. Exactly what witnesses had described. Exactly what tire impressions suggested. For decades the image had sat unnoticed. Now it became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Experts analyzed the reflection repeatedly. Some believed it showed a pickup truck. Others argued the image quality remained too poor. The debate intensified. Public fascination exploded. And then the investigation took an even stranger turn. Detectives received a package. No return address. No identifying information. Inside was a newspaper clipping from 1985. One of the original articles covering Melissa's disappearance. Certain lines had been highlighted in red marker. Nothing else. No letter. No explanation. Just the clipping. The package instantly triggered alarm bells. Someone had gone to the trouble of locating a decades-old article. Someone wanted investigators to see it. The highlighted sections referenced witness statements never fully explained publicly. Statements involving late-night vehicle activity near the service road. The same theme. Again and again. Vehicles. Movement. Darkness. Secrets. Investigators examined the package for fingerprints and DNA. Results remained inconclusive. Yet many detectives privately believed the sender possessed personal knowledge of the case. Perhaps guilt. Perhaps fear. Perhaps both. The possibility electrified the task force. Because cold cases often crack not through brilliant deduction, but through pressure. Time changes people. Consciences weaken. Relationships end. Loyalties disappear. The burden of a secret grows heavier every year. And after 4 decades, someone might finally be struggling under the weight. By the spring of 2025, detectives had interviewed more than 70 individuals connected either directly or indirectly to the case. Most provided little. A few provided enough to raise eyebrows. One former resident described hearing rumors in 1985 about a group of local men who frequently gathered near remote areas outside town. Another recalled stories involving illegal activities never formally reported. Neither witness offered concrete evidence. Yet both accounts hinted at something investigators feared. What if Melissa stumbled onto something? Not necessarily a murder. Not necessarily a conspiracy. Just something she wasn't supposed to see. The anonymous letter from decades earlier suddenly felt more unsettling than ever. She saw everything. Investigators returned to those words repeatedly. She saw everything. The phrase echoed through conference rooms. Evidence reviews. Strategy meetings. Nobody could shake it. Because if the letter writer knew the truth, then those 3 words might represent the closest thing the case had ever received to a confession. Outside the investigation, the community struggled with renewed uncertainty. Families who once believed closure might never come suddenly found hope. Others felt dread. Businesses displayed faded missing person posters. Churches organized vigils. Former classmates gathered to share memories. The town seemed trapped between past and present, between grief and anticipation, between answers and another generation of questions. And somewhere beyond public view, investigators quietly followed a trail that appeared to be narrowing. A trail built from DNA, old witness statements, forgotten photographs, anonymous messages, a mysterious stranger, and a dark vehicle repeatedly appearing at the edge of the story. The pieces still refused to fit neatly together. But for the first time in nearly 40 years, detectives no longer felt as though they were staring into complete darkness. Something was there, something hidden, something close enough to touch. And as the investigation pushed forward, a growing number of people began asking the same unsettling question. Not whether Melissa Hart's disappearance could finally be solved, but whether the person responsible had any idea that the walls were beginning to close in. The investigation stopped feeling like a search and started feeling like a tightening loop. Every new lead didn't open the case wider anymore. It pulled it inward, toward the same cluster of names, the same stretch of road, the same unanswered night in 1985 that refused to fade no matter how many decades passed. Detectives noticed the pattern first, not in the evidence itself, but in how the evidence behaved. Everything converged. The service road outside town, the dark pickup truck, the anonymous letters, the unidentified DNA. And now, something even more unsettling. A second, previously overlooked witness statement resurfaced from the original case file archive. It had been filed under non-relevant, never followed up, never revisited. Until now. The statement came from a teenage couple in 1985 who had been parked on a hillside overlooking a distant stretch of highway the night Melissa Hart disappeared. At the time, investigators dismissed their account as unreliable. Too far away, too dark, too vague. But the couple had described something specific. 2 sets of headlights moving in sequence. One vehicle traveling fast, the other trailing behind. Then both disappearing off the main road toward the service route. What made the statement alarming wasn't just the content. It was the timing. The couple had placed the sighting within minutes of Melissa's last known location. For decades, that statement had been buried under hundreds of competing narratives. Now it reemerged like a fragment of a puzzle suddenly returned to the table. And it aligned too perfectly with everything else. Too neatly. Too disturbingly. Investigators began reconstructing the geography of that night with surgical precision. Old maps were digitized. Terrain models were rebuilt. Line-of-sight simulations were run to determine what the teenage couple could realistically have seen from their vantage point. The results were unexpected. Their view of the highway wasn't as limited as previously assumed. Under certain conditions, clear night, minimal fog, the hillside offered a partial visual corridor directly toward the service road intersection, meaning their account, once considered unreliable, was now physically plausible. That shift changed everything. Because if they were telling the truth, then Melissa wasn't alone after she left town. She was being followed, or guided, or both. The distinction mattered, and investigators knew it. At the same time, forensic genealogists continued working through the DNA lineage connected to the unidentified male profile. The family tree narrowed. Branches were eliminated one by one. Deaths removed possibilities. Out-of-state relocations reduced relevance. But one branch remained stubbornly present. A small cluster of relatives who, during the mid-1980s, lived within a 30-mile radius of the service road. Among them was a name that had appeared before in passing. Not in the original suspect list. Not in any arrest record. But in a background interview note buried in the margins of a 1986 follow-up report. A man who had been questioned briefly about unrelated suspicious activity near rural properties. No charges. No formal suspicion. Just a note. A name. And then silence. Now that name reappeared in the genealogical mapping. Highlighted. Re-examined. Reweighted. Investigators didn't jump to conclusions. But they didn't ignore it either. They quietly expanded surveillance on living relatives connected to that branch. Financial records were reviewed. Old employment histories resurfaced. Property ownership patterns were mapped. A portrait began forming, not of a single suspect, but of a network of proximity. People who had been near the right places at the right times. Or the wrong times, depending on perspective. Meanwhile, the town outside the investigation was beginning to fracture under renewed scrutiny. Old friendships strained. Former neighbors stopped speaking. Every conversation about the case carried an edge now. Because with each new development, the possibility of familiarity with the truth became more uncomfortable. It was no longer just a missing person story. It was becoming something else. Something closer to exposure. And exposure always changes people. One evening, investigators received a breakthrough that did not come from forensic science or archival research. It came from fear. A voicemail left on a tip line. The voice was distorted, intentionally masked. But the message was clear. I know what you're looking at. Stop digging into the service road. Then a pause. Breathing. Then one final line. You don't understand what was there. The call lasted less than 20 seconds. But it triggered an immediate escalation. Forensic audio analysts attempted to enhance the recording. Background noise suggested the call originated from a mobile device rather than a landline, possibly even within driving distance of the town, which meant someone close, someone watching, or someone involved. The phrase, "what was there," became a fixation. Investigators replayed it repeatedly, not because it provided answers, but because it suggested boundaries, a warning, a line that should not be crossed. And yet, they had already crossed it decades earlier. They just didn't know it at the time. As pressure increased, detectives revisited the reflection captured in the rear window of Melissa's abandoned vehicle. This time, they applied newer imaging techniques developed only in the last few years. The enhancement did not produce a clear image, but it produced something more interesting: movement analysis. By isolating subtle distortions in the glass reflection, analysts determined that the second vehicle behind Melissa's car was not stationary. It had been angled slightly, positioned as if preparing to move or block. The implication was chilling. If the interpretation was correct, Melissa's car had not simply been abandoned. It had been part of an active scene, a moment still unfolding when the image was captured. Not aftermath. Interaction. Then came another twist. A retired dispatcher from 1985 came forward after hearing renewed coverage of the case. He claimed something had always bothered him about that night. A call log entry that never made sense. A brief radio transmission recorded near midnight referencing a possible roadside disturbance near the same service route. The dispatch notes were incomplete. The responding unit was never clearly identified in later summaries. And according to the retired dispatcher, the call was downgraded within minutes. He never understood why. But now, decades later, he wondered if it had been connected. Investigators requested the original radio archives. What remained of them was fragmented, corrupted, partially lost. But enough survived to confirm one unsettling detail. A unit had been assigned to the area shortly after Melissa's disappearance window, and then removed from the case log without clear documentation. That revelation introduced a new dimension to the investigation, because now it wasn't just about what happened on the service road. It was about who may have arrived after, and why that arrival was never fully recorded. Public reaction intensified again. Podcasts began dissecting every known detail in real time. Online communities debated theories overnight. Some insisted the case pointed toward a single opportunistic offender. Others argued for coordinated activity involving multiple individuals. Neither theory could be proven. Both felt plausible, depending on which evidence you emphasized. Investigators, however, were no longer focusing on theories. They were focusing on convergence. Because despite the noise, everything was pointing toward one central truth. The disappearance was not random. It was anchored to place, anchored to people, anchored to something that had remained hidden for decades under layers of silence and time. And as surveillance tightened around individuals linked to the genealogical profile, something unexpected happened. One of them moved. Not dramatically, not in panic, just a sudden change in routine, a deviation from long-established patterns, a trip taken without explanation, to a location near the original service road, the same stretch of land that had started it all. Investigators noted the movement immediately. No intervention, no confrontation, just observation. Because at this stage, one wrong step could collapse everything. So they waited, tracked, recorded, and watched as the past began circling back toward the place it had never truly left. The service road was no longer just a location on a map. It was becoming a focal point of pressure, a point where timelines overlapped, where memory, evidence, and fear intersected. And somewhere within that intersection, investigators believed the truth was finally beginning to surface. Slowly, carefully, unwilling to reveal itself all at once, but no longer hidden in the same way it once was. Because after nearly 40 years of silence, something had started to move again. And this time, it wasn't the investigation chasing the past. It was the past reacting to being chased. The first sign that something had shifted was not an arrest, not a confession, and not even a new piece of evidence. It was silence, a very specific kind of silence, the kind that follows movement when movement suddenly stops. For 3 days, surveillance teams tracking the subject tied to the genealogical branch reported near total inactivity. No calls, no travel, no visible routine. A life that had, until then, followed predictable loops suddenly flattened into stillness. Investigators didn't celebrate it. They recognized it. In long-term investigations, silence is rarely peace. It is preparation. The service road, once a forgotten strip of cracked asphalt and overgrown brush, now sat at the center of renewed tactical attention. Drone sweeps began at dawn. Night vision passes followed after sunset. Every angle of the terrain was re-examined with modern mapping tools that could reveal disturbances invisible to the naked eye. And still nothing moved. But something felt wrong. Veteran detectives described it later as pressure without direction, as if the environment itself was waiting for an event already scheduled but not yet visible. Then, on the fourth night, movement returned. A vehicle, unregistered in the immediate database cross-check. Dark in color. Pickup configuration. It entered the monitored zone just after 11:42 p.m. No headlights at first. Coasting. Then a brief flash as it slowed near the old service road entrance. The same entrance tied to every major thread in the case. Every witness. Every fragment of evidence. Every unanswered question. The vehicle paused for exactly 17 seconds. Then turned in. No sirens. No pursuit. Just quiet entry into a place that had already absorbed too many unanswered stories. Surveillance teams immediately adjusted positioning, but distance limitations and terrain interference made real-time clarity difficult. The truck disappeared into the tree line, swallowed by darkness and elevation shifts that had protected secrets for decades. What happened next would be reconstructed later from partial camera feeds, audio fragments, and thermal imaging gaps. At the time, all investigators had was uncertainty, and the knowledge that something long dormant had just been reactivated. Inside command, decisions were made quickly but carefully. No immediate interception. The risk of contaminating a potential breakthrough was too high. Instead, units tightened the perimeter. Road access points were quietly monitored. Exit routes were mapped. Every possible movement corridor was accounted for. The goal was containment, not confrontation. Because if the vehicle was connected to the case, then the truth might finally be within reach. And if it wasn't, the entire operation risked collapsing under a false lead. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then another. No communication from inside the service road zone. No secondary vehicles detected. Just static readings and fragmented signals. Then, at 1:08 a.m., thermal imaging picked up a brief anomaly. A heat signature. Stationary. Near the approximate location where Melissa Hart's abandoned vehicle had been discovered in 1985. The signature lasted less than 90 seconds. Then vanished. Investigators reviewing the feed later disagreed on what it represented. A person standing still. A reflective surface. A residual environmental distortion. Or something more deliberate. Something staged. But at the time, no one had certainty. Only tension. Then came the second development. A radio transmission. Faint. Partially obstructed by interference. But unmistakably originating from within the monitored perimeter. A voice. Male. Unidentified. 3 words. Still nothing here. Followed by static. Then silence. The phrase should have been meaningless. But in the context of everything that had come before, it felt like confirmation of awareness. Someone inside the zone knew they were being monitored, or was pretending not to know. The distinction became critical, because deception in real time changes everything. Command hesitated. If the subject had detected surveillance, the situation could escalate unpredictably. But waiting carried its own risks. So a decision was made. A controlled approach. 2 units advanced slowly toward the entry point of the service road, maintaining radio silence except for emergency channels. Ground visibility was near zero. Brush density had increased over decades of neglect. The terrain itself resisted intrusion. Every step forward felt like moving backward into time. Then one of the units spotted something. A mark. Fresh tire impressions. Not old. Not weathered. Recent. Very recent. The pattern matched a pickup truck. The same configuration seen entering the zone earlier. But there was something else. Another set of impressions. Smaller. Lighter. Possibly from a secondary vehicle. Or possibly from an earlier arrival that had gone unnoticed. The implications were immediate. Multiple entries. Or staged movement. Or a coordinated presence. As officers followed the tracks deeper, they reached a clearing partially hidden by overgrowth. At first glance, it appeared empty. No vehicle, no movement, no sound. But then the ground detail changed. Disturbed soil, recent displacement, and something partially buried beneath brush. A reflective surface, metallic, corroded but intact. The remains of a vehicle panel. Investigators froze the moment they realized what they were seeing. It wasn't just debris. It was part of a car. And based on color remnants beneath oxidation, it matched the blue sedan reported missing in 1985. Melissa Hart's vehicle, or what remained of it. For nearly 4 decades, the car had been described as abandoned and later towed. But official records only confirmed its initial discovery, not its final disposition. Now here it was, or part of it, hidden deliberately, or forgotten deliberately. The discovery sent immediate shockwaves through command. Because if the vehicle had been concealed rather than processed, it suggested something far more serious than a missing person case. It suggested evidence management, control, intentional concealment of a crime scene element. Before a full excavation could be authorized, another alert came through. The surveillance perimeter had detected movement again. The pickup truck was leaving. No lights. Same entry point reversed. No pursuit yet. But timing was critical. Investigators faced a decision that would define the direction of the entire case. Secure the discovered vehicle remains, or follow the moving target. They could not do both without risk of losing both threads. And for the first time since the investigation reopened, disagreement fractured the command structure. Some argued the car fragment was the breakthrough they had waited decades for. Others insisted the moving vehicle represented the living connection to everything else. The past versus the present. Evidence versus opportunity. Truth versus access. And while decisions were being debated in urgent, compressed silence, the pickup truck continued its exit route, slipping back through the same darkness it had entered. As if nothing had happened. As if it had always known how to leave. And in the clearing behind it, buried beneath decades of earth and silence, the remains of a long-forgotten vehicle waited to finally be fully uncovered. Not as an answer, but as a question that had just become impossible to ignore. The moment the pickup truck crossed the outer perimeter line, the investigation split into 2 parallel realities. One team stayed behind with the buried vehicle fragment. The other moved in pursuit of something still in motion. And for the first time since the case reopened, both paths felt equally dangerous. The service road exit point was no longer just an access route. It had become a threshold between what had been hidden for decades and what was still actively being controlled in real time. The pickup didn't accelerate. It didn't flee in panic. It moved with restraint, measured speed, deliberate spacing between turns. As if the driver already knew the terrain, the surveillance gaps, the timing of response units. That realization unsettled command immediately. This wasn't random movement. This was familiarity. The kind that comes from repetition, or memory, or involvement. Meanwhile, at the excavation site, forensic teams began carefully exposing the buried remains. Brush was cleared layer by layer. Soil was documented before being removed. Every fragment was cataloged before being touched. And slowly, the shape beneath the earth became clearer. A vehicle structure. Twisted. Compressed. Time-worn but unmistakable. The blue paint, though faded beyond recognition in most areas, still clung to protected metal surfaces beneath dirt and corrosion. And then came the detail that changed the entire tone of the excavation. A partial VIN plate. Corroded but legible enough to extract fragments of identification numbers. When run through historical databases, the partial sequence matched records linked to a 1980s midsize sedan registered in the region. Registered to Melissa Hart. There was no ambiguity anymore. This was not a mistaken identity. Not a similar vehicle. It was hers. Or what remained of it. The confirmation hit command channels like a physical impact. For decades, the official narrative had suggested the vehicle was found abandoned and processed. Now evidence indicated something else entirely. It had been concealed. Intentionally or otherwise, it had not been properly accounted for. And that raised a question investigators were not prepared to answer immediately. Who moved it? And when? Back on the pursuit route, the pickup truck continued through rural stretches where modern surveillance coverage became inconsistent. Tree cover thickened. Road quality deteriorated. Signal loss increased in intermittent bursts. But drone support maintained partial visual contact. Enough to confirm movement. Not enough to anticipate intention. Then something unexpected happened. The truck slowed. Not due to obstruction. Not due to terrain. But at a point that held no obvious geographic significance. A roadside turnout overlooking a shallow ravine. The vehicle paused. Engine still running. Lights off. No visible exit. No immediate action. Just stillness. Command analyzed the behavior in real time. Was this a stop? A meeting point? A transfer? Or a deliberate attempt to disrupt tracking? Minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. No secondary vehicle appeared. No radio communication was detected. The truck remained stationary, as if waiting for something that never arrived. Back at excavation, forensic teams uncovered more of the buried vehicle. The driver's side was partially intact. The interior, however, had collapsed under decades of pressure. What remained suggested forced deformation rather than natural decay. One technician made a quiet observation that immediately spread through the team. The vehicle did not appear to have simply been left there. It looked compressed into place, as if the earth had been used to hold it, to conceal it, to stabilize it, not abandon it. The distinction mattered, because abandonment implies neglect. Concealment implies intent. And intent changes the entire framework of the case. Inside the cabin, fragments of personal items were recovered, too degraded for immediate identification, but catalogued for later reconstruction. Every piece added weight to a growing conclusion that investigators were reluctant to state aloud. Melissa Hart's disappearance may not have ended with the abandoned car. It may have begun there, or continued beyond it in a way never officially documented. Then another discovery emerged. A second set of tool marks near the vehicle frame. Fresh in geological terms, but inconsistent with 1980s excavation methods, which suggested someone had accessed or disturbed the site long after the original disappearance, possibly within the last decade. That revelation triggered immediate concern. If the burial site had been tampered with recently, then someone knew exactly where it was, and had returned. At the same time, the stalled pickup truck suddenly resumed movement, without warning, without external stimulus. It turned off the turnout point and re-entered the main road. Heading north, Command immediately ordered full tracking engagement. But now the situation had changed. What had once been a controlled observation had become an active pursuit. The truck accelerated slightly, not aggressively, but decisively, as if a decision had been made, or an unseen delay had ended. As units followed, a new complication emerged. The route the truck was taking did not lead away from the investigation. It led toward it, specifically toward the excavation site, toward the buried vehicle, toward the center of the renewed investigation. That realization created immediate tension across command channels, because if accurate, it meant the driver was not escaping. They were returning, whether intentionally or unknowingly. The vehicle was moving back into the heart of the case. Meanwhile, at the excavation site, supervisors ordered a temporary halt. All personnel were instructed to maintain position. No further digging. No exposure of additional evidence. Because if the approaching vehicle was connected, then the site itself could become compromised in real time. Silence fell over the clearing. Not peaceful silence. Operational silence. The kind that precedes impact. Minutes later, distant engine sound became audible to ground teams. Not loud, not close, but approaching. The same pickup, or one indistinguishable from it at distance. No one moved. No one spoke. Then radio confirmation arrived from aerial surveillance. The truck was less than 2 kilometers away. And closing. The excavation site, once a forgotten patch of overgrown terrain, now felt like the center of a tightening circle. Evidence buried beneath soil. A vehicle returning through the night. And investigators caught between preservation and confrontation. Then, unexpectedly, the truck slowed again. This time near a bend in the road, where visibility dropped sharply due to elevation and tree cover. And then it stopped. Completely. No engine movement. No lights. No visible exit. Command attempted to re-establish visual contact. But the terrain swallowed the signal again. For several seconds, nothing was visible. Then a faint thermal reading appeared. Not from the vehicle, but nearby. On foot, a second heat signature. Separate, moving away from the truck. Slowly, deliberately, into the surrounding terrain. This was no longer a single-vehicle scenario. It never had been. And as investigators recalibrated their understanding in real time, one fact became unavoidable. Whatever had been buried in that clearing decades ago was no longer the only thing hidden in this case. Something else had been moving alongside it, watching it, protecting it, or waiting for it. And now, both past and present were converging toward the same point. The excavation site, where truth was no longer buried quietly, but about to be confronted directly. The first contact did not come as an explosion or a confrontation. It came as a mistake, a single misstep in the dark. At the excavation site, one of the perimeter units reported movement at the outer tree line. Not confirmed at first, just a flicker of motion caught in the edge of infrared vision. Then another, then a pattern. Something was circling the perimeter. Not approaching directly, not retreating, circling. Command immediately tightened the formation. Officers were instructed to maintain positions. No engagement unless visual identification was confirmed. The buried vehicle remained partially exposed, its rusted frame now fully outlined under portable floodlights that cut through the forest darkness like surgical blades. And yet, even under bright illumination, the feeling of exposure did not fade. It intensified, because visibility did not mean control. And control was exactly what everyone was trying to hold on to. Then came the second signal, a radio interruption. Not from command, not from patrol units, but from a frequency that should have been unused. A short burst of static, followed by a voice. Calm. Close. Male. Unidentified. You're digging in the wrong place. The transmission lasted less than 5 seconds. Then silence. The reaction was immediate and disorganized. Multiple units attempted triangulation. Signal tracing began instantly, but the transmission source vanished as quickly as it appeared. No stable lock. No directional confirmation. Just interference and uncertainty. The phrase itself, however, lingered. Wrong place. It echoed through command like a warning that had arrived too late to be useful, because they were already standing on top of the only confirmed physical evidence in decades. So what could possibly be wrong? Back on the northern route, the pursuit had fractured. The pickup truck, still unregistered in any recent database, had split attention between aerial surveillance and ground units. But now, with the second heat signature confirmed moving separately from the vehicle, the situation had changed classification entirely. This was no longer a single subject. It was coordination. The truck continued forward for another kilometer before slowing again. This time, it did not stop on a roadside turnout. It stopped directly beneath an old overpass structure that had not been used for traffic in years. A forgotten piece of infrastructure. Concrete pillars. Heavy shadow coverage. A place designed for visibility control. The truck's engine shut off. No doors opened. No movement detected. But aerial units confirmed something critical. The second heat signature previously tracked on foot was now converging toward the same location. From a different angle. From the East Ridge Line. Command realized what they were seeing only seconds later. A rendezvous. Or a handoff. Or something more structured. Something planned. At the excavation site, forensic teams resumed controlled digging under strict supervision. The partially exposed vehicle was now fully confirmed as Melissa Hart's sedan. The condition of the remains suggested not just burial, but compression under significant force. Soil displacement analysis indicated the vehicle had been sealed deliberately, with layers of earth compacted over time. But what mattered more was what was not inside. No obvious signs of forced entry. No clear indication of struggle within the cabin, which introduced an uncomfortable possibility investigators had been avoiding. What if the car was not the final scene? What if it was only a stage? And what if Melissa Hart had left it alive? The idea was not spoken aloud in command, but it was present, uncomfortably present. Then came another discovery inside the vehicle frame. A small object, recovered from beneath collapsed dashboard material. A wristwatch, stopped at 10:17. The same time frame that witness estimates had consistently clustered around for decades. Not exact, but consistent enough to tighten the timeline into something far more precise than before. 10:17 p.m. the moment the narrative of uncertainty began to condense into something sharper, something defined. Meanwhile, under the overpass, the convergence event reached its peak. The truck remained stationary. The second heat signature arrived on foot, then stopped. No visible interaction recorded yet. But thermal imaging confirmed proximity within meters. Command attempted audio surveillance enhancement. Fragments of low-level sound were detected. Not dialogue. Movement. Breathing. Then something else. A metallic sound. Like a door being opened. But no door movement was visible from the truck. And that contradiction created immediate confusion. Because either the sensors were misinterpreting environmental distortion, or something was happening outside visual confirmation range. At the excavation site, tension escalated as another anomaly was detected. A second object buried deeper beneath the vehicle. Not part of the chassis. Not part of the original structure. Something separate. Compact. Rectangular. Wrapped in deteriorated material. When carefully extracted, it revealed itself as a sealed evidence container. Old. Official. But not catalogued in any known chain of custody record from the original investigation, meaning it had either been misplaced decades ago or deliberately removed from documentation. Inside the container were photographs, not from the burial site, not from the car, but from the original 1985 investigation phase. And one image immediately changed the atmosphere on site. A photograph showing the service road at night. 2 vehicles visible, one matching Melissa Hart's sedan, the other parked behind it at an angle that suggested control rather than coincidence. And beside the second vehicle, a figure, partially obscured, but present, not a shadow, not a blur, a person. Command ordered immediate secure transmission of all recovered materials to headquarters. But before the order could fully process, another update came from the overpass team. The second heat signature had disappeared. Not moved. Not retreated. Disappeared. Simultaneously, the truck engine restarted, and the vehicle began moving again. Slowly at first. Then faster. Not away from the area, but toward the main highway corridor. As if the convergence had completed, or been interrupted, or intentionally dissolved. And in that moment, investigators realized something deeply unsettling. The encounter they had been monitoring was not a confrontation. It was timing, a moment that had been prepared, executed, and then ended without resolution, as if something had been checked, confirmed, and allowed to continue. Back at the excavation site, the photograph remained under forensic review, but its implications were already spreading through command, because it suggested something that no one had yet stated directly. Melissa Hart's disappearance was not isolated. It was witnessed, documented, and possibly structured in ways that had never been fully investigated. And now, nearly 40 years later, the structure was beginning to show itself again. Not as a memory, not as a rumor, but as a pattern repeating under new conditions. And as both teams prepared to regroup, one truth settled over the entire operation with increasing weight. The case was no longer only about what happened in 1985. It was about what had been preserved since, and who had been preserving it, without interruption. All this time. By the time dawn approached, no one in the field operation had slept. Not because they were waiting for rest, but because rest no longer felt compatible with what they had uncovered. The night had stopped behaving like time. It had started behaving like pressure. At headquarters, the photograph recovered from the buried evidence container was now the central object of analysis. Enlarged, enhanced, reprocessed through multiple imaging pipelines. Each iteration sharpened edges, clarified silhouettes, and removed noise that had concealed details for decades. But clarity did not bring comfort. It brought recognition. The service road, the angle of the vehicles, the positioning that no longer looked accidental in any interpretation. One vehicle behind another, close enough to suggest control, far enough to suggest hesitation. And the figure beside the second vehicle remained the most disturbing element of all. Because enhancement did not eliminate ambiguity, it refined it. And refinement, in this case, only made the presence more deliberate. Not a passerby, not a coincidence. Someone standing within the geometry of the moment, as if they belonged there, as if they were supposed to be there. Field teams at the excavation site had been ordered to maintain full containment overnight, But by early morning, containment had begun to feel like a word without meaning. The buried vehicle had been fully exposed now. Melissa Hart's sedan lay in fragmented ruin, its structure compressed, its frame distorted by time and force beyond natural decay. Soil analysis confirmed deliberate coverage, layered in stages, suggesting multiple interventions or a single highly controlled burial process. But the most unsettling discovery was not structural. It was absence. There were no definitive signs of a struggle inside the cabin. No blood traces that survived degradation analysis. No clear markers of violence at the immediate point of entry. Just displacement, and silence preserved in physical form, which forced investigators back into the same uncomfortable possibility that had begun forming days earlier. That whatever happened to Melissa Hart did not begin in the car, and may not have ended there either. At 6:14 a.m., surveillance teams tracking the pickup truck reported a sudden loss of signal integrity. Not a full disappearance like before. This time, something more subtle. A fragmentation. The vehicle was still moving, confirmed intermittently through aerial sweeps, but ground tracking systems were receiving conflicting positional data. One system placed it north of the highway corridor. Another placed it stationary near an abandoned service junction. A third failed to register it entirely. It was as if the vehicle was existing in multiple interpretations of space simultaneously. Command immediately suspected technical interference. Signal jamming. Environmental distortion. Equipment malfunction. But none of those explanations fully accounted for the inconsistency across independent systems, which meant something else was happening. Something operational rather than accidental. At the same time, a second development emerged at the excavation site. While documenting the interior of the recovered sedan, a technician identified a modification in the rear seating area. Not damage. Not collapse. A structural alteration. Subtle reinforcement beneath upholstery layers, inconsistent with factory design specifications. At first it was dismissed as aftermarket repair, until closer inspection revealed something embedded beneath the modified paneling. A second compartment. Small, concealed, and sealed from the inside. Opening it required delicate extraction to avoid destroying potential evidence. Inside was a cassette tape, still intact. Label faded but legible enough to identify partial handwriting. No date. No author. Just 2 words. Listen once. The discovery immediately halted all non-essential activity at the site. Audio preservation specialists were brought in under emergency protocol conditions. The tape was carefully transferred to a controlled playback environment. And for the first time in nearly 4 decades, sound from within Melissa Hart's vehicle, or something placed within it, was reintroduced into the investigation. The recording began with static, then a faint mechanical hum, possibly engine noise, possibly ambient interference, then voices. Low, distant, not clearly separated. 2, possibly 3 individuals. The audio quality degraded heavily, but fragments were recoverable. A male voice. Calm. Controlled. You weren't supposed to come this way. A pause. Then another voice. Uncertain. You said it would be empty. Silence. Then movement sounds. A door opening. Metal shifting. Breathing closer to the microphone source. Then a third sound emerged. A female voice. Faint, but unmistakably present. I didn't tell anyone. The words were fragmented by distortion, but the emotional weight behind them was clear even through degraded audio. Fear, confusion, and something else. Realization. The recording ended abruptly. Not with a fade, but with a cut, as if the source had been physically stopped. The room remained silent for several seconds after playback ended. No one spoke, not because they lacked interpretation, but because interpretation was already forming too quickly, too sharply, too dangerously. Then command broke the silence with a single instruction. Cross-reference every recovered audio fragment with known witness statements. Immediately, back in the field, the pickup truck's reappearance pattern began to reassert itself. After the earlier signal fragmentation, it re-entered clean tracking range near the northern highway corridor. But instead of continuing away from the investigation zone, it slowed again. This time near a populated intersection. Not rural, not isolated, visible. A deliberate contrast to everything that had preceded it. Then it stopped. No engine shut off. No exit. Just stationary presence. As if waiting for something to catch up, or for attention to shift, or for pressure to redistribute. And then, unexpectedly, a third anomaly appeared. Not from the truck, not from the excavation site, but from historical archives. A previously unprocessed interview tape from 1985 surfaced during a secondary review of storage inventories. It had been mislabeled, filed under unrelated casework, never digitized, never transcribed. When finally played, the voice on the recording belonged to a woman who had been interviewed during the original investigation, but never considered a key witness. Her statement, at the time, had been dismissed as emotional speculation. Now it carried a different tone entirely. She described seeing Melissa Hart at a gas station hours before her disappearance. But more importantly, she described who she was with. A man she did not recognize, and a second vehicle parked nearby. Dark, pickup style, the same pattern. Again, the repetition was no longer coincidental. It was structural, as if the entire case had been orbiting a limited set of variables that only now were becoming visible in full alignment. Investigators began mapping all confirmed and semi-confirmed sightings across time. When plotted together, something disturbing emerged. The locations did not scatter randomly. They formed a corridor, a path of interaction points stretching from town outskirts to the service road and beyond. Not a single crime scene, but a sequence, a chain. And at the center of that chain sat the buried vehicle site. The implication was immediate. Melissa Hart's disappearance was not an isolated event. It was a trajectory, a progression through space and time that had been partially recorded, but never fully assembled. At 8:47 a.m., Command received another update from surveillance. The pickup truck had resumed movement, but now its direction was no longer ambiguous. It was heading directly toward the corridor mapped from historical sightings. Not away from it, not parallel, directly into it, as if retracing steps already taken decades ago, or completing a loop that had never properly closed. And as the truck advanced, investigators at the excavation site began to notice something else. The soil around the buried vehicle was shifting, not due to excavation, not due to environmental factors, but subtle vibration patterns consistent with nearby heavy movement. A resonance, as if the ground itself was responding to something approaching, or something returning. Command issued a final directive. All units converge on central corridor. Maintain observation integrity. No engagement unless necessary. But even as the order was transmitted, one fact had already settled across every screen, every channel, every observation point. The case was no longer divided between past and present. It had become a single continuous event, one that had begun in 1985, and had never truly stopped moving, only paused, waiting for the moment when every fragment would finally align. And that moment was no longer ahead. It was already in motion. The convergence point was no longer theoretical. It was geographic. Every active unit, every surveillance feed, every recovered fragment of evidence now pointed toward a narrowing corridor of land where old roads, abandoned infrastructure, and forgotten terrain intersected like scars that never fully healed. And at the center of that intersection, the service road sat again. Not as a memory, but as a destination. By late morning, aerial surveillance confirmed multiple movements within the expanded perimeter. Units that had been tracking separate trajectories were now being drawn toward a single zone without explicit coordination. It was not strategy driving them anymore. It was alignment, as if the investigation itself had developed gravity. At Excavation Command, the buried vehicle site had stabilized under full forensic control. But stabilization did not mean resolution. The soil had been documented, the frame mapped, the interior cataloged. But the deeper they went into reconstruction, the more fragmented the narrative became. Because evidence was no longer behaving like isolated proof. It was behaving like sequence fragments that refused to stand alone. And every attempt to assemble them introduced new contradictions. The cassette tape audio, the recovered photograph, the buried sedan, the genealogical DNA branch, the overlapping witness accounts. All of it began forming a pattern that was no longer linear. It was cyclical, repeated, reinforced. At 11:03 a.m., surveillance teams reported a critical change in the northern corridor. The pickup truck, which had been moving steadily along mapped routes, suddenly deviated from the expected trajectory. Not abruptly, not evasively, but with precision. It turned onto an unmarked access road that had not been part of the original 1985 map overlays, but appeared in older county land records as a maintenance route leading toward private acreage. A route rarely used, and almost never monitored. Command immediately recognized the significance. This was not escape behavior. It was navigation. Familiar navigation. The truck was not avoiding detection. It was following something, or returning to something. At the same time, ground teams near the central corridor began reporting unusual environmental readings. Radio interference increased. Not random. Structured. Pulsing in intervals that disrupted communication channels in predictable cycles. One technician described it as breathing static. Interference that rose and fell like a signal trying to communicate through distortion. Then came visual confirmation. A secondary vehicle appeared briefly on a ridge line overlooking the corridor. Not the pickup. A different silhouette. Stationary. No movement detected from within. But its presence alone caused immediate reassessment of threat classification. Because now the assumption of a single moving subject was no longer valid. There were multiple points of coordination. Multiple positions. Multiple layers of awareness. At excavation site, one final deep scan of the buried sedan produced an unexpected result. Beneath the rear chassis, sensors detected a second embedded anomaly. Not organic material. Not environmental debris. A second sealed compartment within the soil layer itself. Deeper than the vehicle's final resting point. Which meant it had not been created during burial. It had existed before it. Excavation was halted immediately. Controlled extraction began under forensic oversight. What emerged was a small metal box. Heavily corroded. But intact. No visible markings. When opened, it contained a single set of keys. Old. Rust-affected. But still recognizable as automotive ignition keys. And attached to them was a tag. Faded. But legible. It contained a partial inscription. Not a name. Not a date. Just a location shorthand. State Route 17. The service road designation. The entire room shifted in tone. Because this was no longer about discovery. It was about intent. Someone had placed keys beneath the burial site. Not as evidence. But as part of a system. A system that extended beyond the car. Beyond Melissa Hart. Beyond even the original investigation. At 11:41 a.m., the pickup truck re-entered high-confidence tracking range. Its position was now unmistakably aligned with the central corridor. But what changed the atmosphere was not its movement. It was its speed. It slowed, then stopped, not at a random point, but directly at the outer boundary of the mapped convergence zone. The same zone where multiple historical sightings overlapped. The same zone where witness statements clustered. The same zone where the buried sedan's timeline had effectively originated. Command attempted immediate communication intercept. No response. Then something unexpected happened. All surveillance feeds across multiple units briefly synchronized into a single-frame distortion. A fraction of a second overlap where multiple camera angles collapsed into the same visual field. And within that distortion, analysts later confirmed a single indistinct shape near the pickup truck. Not clearly human. Not clearly mechanical. Just presence. Then the feeds separated again. Normal view restored. But with one critical difference. The pickup truck was gone. Not moved out of frame. Not obscured by terrain. Gone. And simultaneously, the secondary ridgeline vehicle also disappeared from observation. No heat signature. No movement trail. No exit detection. Just absence. As if both had been removed from the system at the same moment. At the same time, deep within the excavation site, one of the monitoring sensors registered a sudden drop in ground vibration activity. The soil surrounding the buried sedan stabilized. Not naturally, but abruptly, like something had been switched off, or completed. Command was forced into immediate reassessment, because now there were no active moving targets, no visible vehicles, no confirmed subjects in motion, only the evidence. And the implication that everything they had been tracking may have been part of a closed loop rather than an open pursuit. A loop that had just completed itself. Then, without warning, a final archival alert surfaced. A misfiled report from 1985 had been automatically reindexed by the system due to metadata correction from recent evidence tagging. It contained a single handwritten note from an original investigator assigned to the case decades earlier, never officially entered into case summary, never referenced in reports. It read, "If they return to State Route 17, it won't be to continue it. It will be to close it." No signature, no context, just the sentence. And as investigators stared at the phrase, the realization began to settle in quietly. Because nothing about the last 48 hours looked like escalation anymore. It looked like completion. And completion, in a case that had never truly stopped moving, did not feel like an ending. It felt like a transition into something that had been waiting to resume from exactly where it left off. The first thing that changed was not the evidence. It was the atmosphere around it. By late afternoon, the central corridor no longer felt like an active investigation zone. It felt like a sealed environment that had already finished processing whatever had entered it. Units reported a strange lack of external interference. The radio static that had pulsed in structured patterns earlier in the day simply stopped. Communication channels stabilized. Drone feeds sharpened. Even environmental noise, wind, distant traffic, wildlife, returned in full clarity. That absence of distortion was more unsettling than the interference had ever been, because it suggested the disturbance had ended. Not faded. Ended. At excavation command, the buried sedan remained fully exposed, its frame now documented from every angle. The forensic teams had completed structural mapping, interior scans, and artifact cataloging. Yet no one moved to close the site. No one declared completion. There was a shared hesitation, unspoken but uniform, as if leaving the site unfinished was safer than acknowledging what finishing it might mean. Inside the recovered evidence pipeline, the cassette tape, the photograph, and the sealed containers were now part of a consolidated reconstruction model. Analysts attempted to layer them chronologically, but something resisted alignment. The timeline refused to behave like a single narrative. Instead, it folded. Certain events repeated under different conditions. Witness accounts overlapped with audio fragments in ways that suggested partial reoccurrence rather than simple memory. It was as if the investigation was not reconstructing a past event. It was reconstructing multiple passes of the same event. At 1622, a final field report arrived from the northern corridor. The pickup truck had not been located. No wreckage. No abandonment site. No traceable exit route. Just disappearance from all active systems simultaneously, with no corresponding alert from perimeter sensors. The secondary Ridgeline vehicle was also unaccounted for. Search expansion teams were deployed immediately, but terrain analysis showed no recent tire impressions beyond a certain boundary point. The corridor simply stopped producing evidence of movement, and that fact introduced a new, uncomfortable interpretation. What if movement had never been the point? At the excavation site, one final inspection of the buried sedan revealed something that had previously been overlooked. Not an object. A condition. The soil surrounding the vehicle was not uniformly disturbed. It was layered. Multiple compaction phases were visible under high-resolution scanning, which meant the burial had not happened in a single moment. It had happened in stages, separated by time, possibly years. This contradicted earlier assumptions that the vehicle had been concealed shortly after the disappearance. Instead, it suggested repeated interaction with the site. Revisits, resealings, adjustments, maintenance. The word that surfaced in internal notes was curation. Someone had not simply buried the car. They had managed its presence. And that realization changed everything about the case's structure. Because management implies awareness over time. At 1705, Command received an unexpected visitor to the perimeter checkpoint. A retired county records clerk. No law enforcement affiliation. No official role in the investigation. She arrived voluntarily, carrying a sealed envelope she claimed had never been submitted during the original 1985 file compilation due to administrative oversight. Inside the envelope was a photocopy of a map. Hand-marked. Old. Faded. It showed the service road and surrounding terrain as it existed in the mid-1980s. But what made it significant were the annotations. Several locations were circled, each one labeled with shorthand initials. State Route 17 appeared again. But so did two additional markers that had never appeared in any official case documentation. One of them corresponded directly to the ridgeline observation point. The other aligned with the overpass convergence zone. 3 points. Not random. Not isolated. A triangle. When overlaid with modern GIS reconstruction, the pattern became undeniable. The entire investigation had been unfolding within a pre-existing spatial framework that had never been officially acknowledged. And that framework suggested intentional structuring of activity zones long before Melissa Hart's disappearance. The implication landed heavily across command, because it meant the geography itself may not have been passive. It may have been part of the design. At 1840, another anomaly emerged. A delayed audio reconstruction from the cassette tape was reprocessed using improved signal recovery techniques. A previously inaudible segment became partially intelligible. A few seconds of clarity emerged from the distortion. A male voice closer than before. Not speaking to the group. Speaking toward the environment. You said it would reset after this. A pause. Then another voice, lower, controlled. It does. It always does. Silence followed. Then a final fragment. A female voice, almost overlapping with environmental noise. Then why do I remember it differently every time? The recording cut. Not degraded. Not faded. Cut. The implication was immediate, but not spoken aloud. Because it suggested something far more destabilizing than a single unresolved crime. It suggested repetition. Or revision. Or cycles of reenactment under changing conditions. At 1912, all remaining field units were ordered to consolidate at Central Command. The excavation site was sealed under protective protocol, pending full forensic transfer. No further digging was authorized. No additional field expansion permitted. And yet, even as containment procedures were enacted, something remained unresolved. Because no suspect had been confirmed. No arrest made. No direct confrontation occurred. Only disappearance. Only convergence. Only evidence of structured absence. As night fell over the corridor, the land itself seemed to settle, not in relief, but in completion. And investigators, reviewing every fragment of the past 2 days, began arriving at the same quiet conclusion independently. Whatever had been uncovered was not the resolution of a cold case. It was the final exposure of a system that had been operating just beneath visibility for decades. A system that did not end when evidence was found. A system that only paused long enough to be observed. And somewhere within that realization, one question began to surface more clearly than all others. Not what happened to Melissa Hart, but what exactly had been allowed to remain in place after she disappeared. Night did not arrive with escalation. It arrived with stabilization. The kind of quiet that feels engineered rather than natural, as if the environment had been tuned down to a lower frequency and locked there. At the Central Command site, every active feed remained online, but none of them showed movement. The excavation zone was secure. The corridor was sealed. The overpass, the ridge line, the service road, all of it had been reduced to static geography again. But no one treated it as peace. They treated it as a pause between phases. Inside the evidence facility, the recovered sedan from Melissa Hart's case was now fully documented, dismantled in controlled layers of analysis, and reconstructed digitally in forensic simulation. Every bolt, every deformation, every soil layer had been mapped into a 3D model that could be rotated, paused, and examined at microscale resolution. And yet, despite total reconstruction, one detail refused to integrate cleanly into the model: the timing. Every piece of evidence pointed back to a narrow window around 10:17 p.m. But the sequence inside that window did not resolve into a single linear event. It behaved like overlapping versions of the same moment, as if multiple interpretations of what happened at State Route 17 were competing for coherence. At 22:41, a final sweep of the service road corridor was authorized despite the earlier containment order. The rationale was simple: verify absence. Confirm that no remaining movement or hidden assets were still active in the field. What the sweep found instead was unexpected. The service road itself had changed. Not structurally, not physically, but visually. Drone operators reported that the terrain mapping no longer matched historical overlays with full accuracy. Sections of road that had been clearly visible in earlier scans now appeared partially obscured by environmental distortion patterns. subtle inconsistencies in elevation rendering, as if the digital model could not fully agree with what it was observing. Ground teams confirmed the same issue in person. The road was there, but it no longer felt fully anchored in mapping systems, as if the record and the reality were drifting slightly apart. At the same time, analysts reviewing archival data discovered something that shifted the entire framework of interpretation again. A previously unnoticed metadata tag embedded in multiple 1985 reports, not in narrative text, in classification headers, a repeating code sequence attached to unrelated documents connected to Melissa Hart's disappearance. State Route 17 was present again, but so was a secondary marker, cycle review. At first, it was assumed to be internal administrative shorthand from the original department, but cross-referencing with older case files revealed something more troubling. The same tag appeared in unrelated missing person cases from adjacent counties during the same period. Different victims, different investigators, same classification phrase, which suggested coordination beyond a single case file, a procedural pattern, or something institutional. At 2318, the most significant development of the night emerged not from the field, but from the recovered cassette audio, which had been subjected to one final high-resolution reprocessing attempt. A segment previously dismissed as noise stabilized into partial clarity. This time, the voices were more distinct. 3 voices again, but now with clearer separation. The male voice from earlier returned, more controlled than before. "This is the last pass." A second voice responded immediately. "You said that before." A pause. Then a third voice closer, more unstable. "If we close it, what stays?" Silence. Then the first voice again. Only what survived it. The phrase was not spoken with emotion. It was spoken as procedure, like instruction, like confirmation. And that changed its weight entirely, because it suggested that what investigators were treating as a disappearance might have been something else in its original context. Not an uncontrolled event, but a managed one. At 0:03, Field Command received a final automated alert from perimeter sensors. Not intrusion, not movement, a recalibration event. Multiple environmental monitoring systems across the corridor briefly synchronized their timestamps and then reset by exactly 12 seconds. No external trigger identified. No software update scheduled. No operator input recorded. Just a uniform temporal shift across independent systems. When engineers reviewed the logs, they found something even more unsettling. The shift was not random. It aligned every system to a single reference point. 10:17 p.m., the moment of Melissa Hart's disappearance. At 0:27, Command convened an emergency closed briefing. No new physical evidence had been recovered. No suspects had been identified. No active subjects remained in surveillance. And yet, the case had not stabilized. It had reorganized. Every piece of evidence now pointed not toward a person, but toward a structure. A repeating framework embedded across geography, documentation, witness memory, and recovered media. And within that structure, Melissa Hart's case was no longer isolated. It was central, not as an origin point, but as the most visible instance of something larger, something repeated, something maintained. At 1:11, the final archival file from the original 1985 investigation was digitally restored from fragmented storage. It had been considered lost, corrupted beyond recovery. But partial reconstruction through overlapping metadata from other cases allowed its contents to reappear in full enough form to read. The final page contained a handwritten note from the lead investigator at the time, not part of official report, added after case closure. It read, "State Route 17 is not where it ends. It is where it resets." No additional explanation. No signature. Just the sentence. And for the first time since the investigation reopened, no one argued about interpretation, because the pattern had become too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, too structured to attribute to error, too persistent to treat as history. Outside, the service road corridor remained still. No vehicles, no heat signatures, no movement, but the absence no longer felt like emptiness. It felt maintained, as if the space had been returned to a state that allowed it to remain ready for what came next. And somewhere within that realization, investigators understood that the question they had been asking all along was incomplete. It was not about who was responsible for Melissa Hart's disappearance. It was about what mechanism had ensured that disappearance could remain coherent across 40 years of fragmented evidence, incomplete memory, and repeated investigative failure. Because something had not only happened in 1985, something had been preserved. And preservation, in this case, had a pattern, a structure, a cycle. And State Route 17 was not just a location inside that structure. It was the point where the structure proved it could still hold. By the time the 11th phase of the investigation began, no one was still pretending this was a standard cold case. The language had changed across every channel, every briefing, every report header. Words like suspect and timeline were still used, but they no longer anchored meaning in the same way. Everything had started to orbit a different concept: structure, repetition, containment. And State Route 17 had become less of a location and more of a reference point for behavior. At 3:42, Command initiated a full retrospective compression analysis of the entire case archive. Every document from 1985 onward was fed into a unified system designed to identify procedural anomalies across decades of fragmented investigation. The system did not return a suspect list. It returned a pattern map. And the pattern map did something no one expected. It highlighted gaps, not evidence, absence. Specifically, synchronized absence. Periods where multiple investigative threads went quiet at the same time across different jurisdictions, despite no administrative linkage between cases. Those gaps aligned. Not randomly, not loosely, precisely. Each one centered around cases tagged in historical records, with overlapping classification language tied to missing persons in rural zones. And at the center of those alignments sat a repeating identifier: State Route 17. It appeared again, not as a direct entry point, but as a gravitational anchor around which procedural silence formed. At 4:11, a field engineer reviewing telemetry logs from the previous night identified something even more disturbing. The environmental interference patterns recorded during the pickup truck's disappearance were not noise artifacts. They were structured intervals, repeating sequences of signal distortion that matched the same temporal spacing found in archival radio interference from 1985. The implication was immediate, though no one stated it outright. The distortion was not incidental. It was consistent, and consistency in this context suggested design. At 5:03, the final physical sweep of the central corridor was authorized, not to search for suspects, but to confirm boundaries. Drones were deployed in a widening spiral from the excavation site, scanning outward along all previously mapped sightlines, including ridge lines, overpass zones, and the full length of State Route 17. What they found did not add new evidence. It recontextualized old geography. Several terrain features that had been treated as separate observation points, ridge, service road, overpass, were revealed under enhanced spatial modeling to form a continuous geometric relationship. Not a triangle this time, a loop, a closed circuit of movement paths that could be traveled without ever leaving the system of observation, which meant every event that had occurred within it, every sighting, every disappearance, every fragment of interaction, had not necessarily been random entries into a space. They may have been transitions within a contained structure. At 5:47, the cassette tape recovered earlier was reanalyzed one final time with a different objective. Not to extract dialogue, but to reconstruct spatial audio positioning. The results were unsettling. The voices on the tape were not stationary. They shifted, slightly, as if recorded in a moving environment that never fully stabilized. Engine noise varied not only in volume, but in directional placement. Doors did not open from a single consistent angle. Even the female voice, Melissa Hart's voice, appeared to change distance relative to the microphone source within the same sentence, which meant one of two things. Either the recording was made under chaotic physical conditions, or it was made in a controlled environment designed to simulate movement. At 6:22, Command received confirmation that no active vehicles remained within surveillance range of the corridor. No pickup truck, no secondary ridgeline vehicle, no traceable exit signatures, just empty terrain. But now, emptiness no longer registered as resolution. It registered as reset conditions. At 6:59, A final archival cross-reference was completed between all recovered case materials and unrelated missing person investigations from the same era. A pattern emerged that no one could ignore. Cases clustered geographically around rural service routes. Each contained at least one of three recurring elements: a dark pickup vehicle, a witness description of multiple positions or angles, and a procedural gap in investigative continuity lasting exactly 1 to 3 days. Not identical cases, not confirmed connections, but structurally similar ones. And every cluster, when mapped historically, showed a tendency to fade and then reappear in documentation cycles years later, as if the cases themselves were being revisited, not solved. At 7:18, Command held a final pre-dawn briefing. No new field data had arrived in over an hour, but no one considered the situation stable, because stability implies closure, and closure was no longer part of the model. The working hypothesis, never formally stated but widely understood, had shifted into something far more abstract. That State Route 17 was not simply a site of disappearance. It was a reference node within a repeating investigative environment, a place where events did not just occur. They aligned. And once aligned, they were preserved in a way that allowed them to re-enter the system decades later under different conditions. At 7:44, the lead analyst presented a final synthesis map. Every confirmed and partial data point from 1985 onward was overlaid into a single dynamic reconstruction. The result was not a timeline. It was a looped corridor of interaction points. And at one point on that loop, everything tightened. Photograph, audio, vehicle evidence, witness sightings, DNA trace, all converged at State Route 17. Not as origin, not as endpoint, but as the point where the loop could be observed from inside. The analysts did not describe it as supernatural. They did not describe it as conspiratorial. They used a different word: systemic. At 8:01, just as dawn began to break over the corridor, a final automated log entry appeared across multiple devices simultaneously. It was not a message, not a warning, just a timestamp correction. All systems briefly recalibrated again, and every log, every feed, every reconstructed timeline shifted by 12 seconds, back to the same reference point, 10:17 p.m. And in that moment, without any new evidence, without any active suspect, without any visible movement in the field, the investigation reached its most unsettling realization yet. Nothing they had uncovered was pointing forward. Everything was pointing back, not to the past as history, but to the past as a repeating condition. And State Route 17, still empty under the morning light, no longer felt like a place where something had happened. It felt like a place where something was still happening, just not in a way that could be seen from outside the loop. By the 12th hour of dawn, the investigation no longer behaved like an investigation at all. It behaved like a system observing itself. Every feed was stable now, every channel clear, every sensor reporting normal conditions across State Route 17 and the surrounding corridor. The terrain showed no movement, no vehicles, no heat signatures, no anomalies in radio frequency bands. And yet, nothing felt resolved, because the absence of activity no longer carried the meaning of emptiness. It carried the weight of completion without explanation. At Central Command, the final synthesis model was still projected across the main display wall. The looped corridor of events remained visible. Ridge line, overpass, service road, excavation site. Each point connected by lines that no longer represented time, but relationship. Not what happened, but how it was allowed to relate. And at the center of that structure, State Route 17 remained unchanged. Not highlighted, not emphasized, just unavoidable. At 9:13, forensic teams completed the last physical inventory of recovered materials from the excavation site. The buried sedan had been fully documented, dismantled, and digitally reconstructed. The cassette tape had been archived, the photographs stabilized, the sealed containers processed. And still, the system flagged one unresolved condition: structural continuity incomplete. No one could resolve it, because nothing was missing. Everything had been accounted for, which made the warning worse, not better. At 9:47, a final field sweep was conducted using autonomous drones with expanded spectral analysis capability. The mission was not to find suspects or vehicles. It was to confirm the absence of residual operational activity within the looped corridor. The drones completed their pass without incident. No movement detected. No environmental interference. No traceable anomalies. But as they returned, one unit recorded something unexpected. A brief temporal distortion spike. Less than a second. Barely enough to register. But enough to corrupt a single frame of visual data. That frame, when isolated and enhanced, showed something that should not have been possible under the recorded conditions. A vehicle. Stationary. At State Route 17. Not the pickup truck. Not the Ridgeline vehicle. Something else. Unidentified. Present for a fraction of a second before disappearing again as the system corrected itself. Command debated whether it was a glitch, or a residual artifact from prior interference, or something more troubling, a moment not fully removed from the system. At 10:02, the lead analyst requested one final cross-reference across all archival datasets, not to find new evidence, but to test stability, to determine whether the loop structure held under full analytical pressure. The system ran for 6 minutes, then returned a result that was not expected. A confirmation, not of guilt, not of cause, but of consistency. Every major event in the case, every sighting, every disappearance, every recovered artifact, every witness statement, fit within a repeating structural cycle anchored at State Route 17. And that cycle did not terminate. It reset. At exactly 10:17 p.m., the timestamp appeared again, not as data, but as constraint. At 10:36, Command initiated closure protocol discussions. Not closure of the case, but closure of the operational phase. Because if the structure was correct, then continued investigation risked reinforcing the loop rather than breaking it. Some argued the opposite, that understanding the system required deeper exposure, that the loop was not a boundary but a map, that State Route 17 was not containment, but repetition under observation. No consensus was reached, because consensus required a model everyone agreed still represented reality. And reality, at this point, was no longer stable across interpretations. At 11:11, a final unscheduled alert arrived from archival systems. A correction had been made to metadata indexing in response to cross-case normalization. One final document had been reclassified and surfaced into active review. It was a single-page field note from 1985, written in handwriting that did not match any known investigator profile. The note contained only one sentence. Do not close State Route 17. It closes itself. No further context. No signature. Just the line. And with that, every active feed across the investigation briefly flickered. Not a blackout. Not a failure. A synchronization. All systems aligned for less than a second. And in that shared frame, every camera, every monitor, every reconstructed dataset displayed the same thing. State Route 17. Empty. Still. Waiting. Then the frame corrected itself, and the investigation returned to normal operation. But nothing about it felt normal anymore, because there was no longer a question of whether the case had been solved. There was only the question of whether it had ever been separate from the system that produced it in the first place. And as the sun moved higher over the quiet corridor, investigators were left with the final, unavoidable realization. Some cases do not end because they are solved. They end because they complete the shape they were always meant to form. And once that shape is complete, the system does not close. It resets. Again, at State Route 17, there was no formal decision to continue the investigation, because at a certain point, continuation is no longer a choice made by command. It becomes the default state of everything that has not yet resolved. And State Route 17, despite every layer of analysis, every reconstructed timeline, every closed report, remained unresolved in the only way that mattered. It still existed in the model, still anchored every pattern, still returned every cycle to 10:17 p.m. But something changed in the hours after the final synchronization. Not in the data, in the behavior of the system observing the data. At 13:04, a junior analyst noticed that the loop model was no longer stable when viewed in full scale. Zoomed out, it held. But zoomed in, it began to fracture into slight variations. Not contradictions. Deviations. Small differences in the ordering of events around State Route 17. A witness statement shifting position by seconds. A vehicle appearing in one version of the corridor, but not another. A sound recording that aligned in one reconstruction and drifted in the next. At first it was dismissed as rendering instability. Then it persisted. And then it spread across multiple